everyone. This is criminal profiler Pat Brown, and I have been asked about why John Ramsey is asking for new DNA testing in the murder of his daughter, Jean. Because most people would think, hey, if he wants more testing, that has to mean his family was never involved, that it was a stranger, or not necessarily a stranger, but definitely not one of the family. It could be a friend of the family, an acquaintance, or it could be a stranger. So this all came about on CrimeCon. Now, CrimeCon is a place where all kinds of people get together, experts and so on, and they discuss all kinds of different crime issues. And John Ramsey was there with Paula Woodward. And Paula Woodward is the author of this book. She's written another one on the Ramsey case, but this is the most recent one. It's called Unsolved: The JonBenet Ramsey Murder 25 Years Later. Now, I read the book. She claims to be, objective and not biased. But no, pretty much you can say she's on Team Ramsey. So I have to take what she says with a grain of salt, because she's putting together things to particularly claim that the police completely botched everything, that they botched the DNA as well, that they pretty much framed the Ramseys, and the media helped frame the Ramseys. So that was what the book was basically about. Had a couple interesting little pieces of information in there, which I'm going to mention before I talk about the DNA, because that's why I'm here, to talk about the DNA. Okay. She did mention a couple things, which I thought were interesting. She said that it was clear that the person knew the layout of the house. So in other words, it would be unlikely to be a complete stranger. Somebody knows the layout of the house, because it was a very huge house. And for somebody to get into the house without, quite frankly, any evidence of them actually getting into the house, and then getting all the way through the house and just luckily picking JonBenet's room and not thinking it could be her parents' room, or her parents could be down the hall, would be somebody has to be very well aware of who's in the home and what the layout is. I agree with her on that. The second thing which was said I thought was interesting was she was pointing out how John Ramsey was really with the retired FBI profiler John Douglas, who believes that the Ramseys are not involved in the murder of their daughter in any way, or any of his family, and supposedly agrees with John Douglas that somebody had to be so angry at him, so angry that they'd come in and kill his daughter as a vengeance thing. And that's why they wrote that weird note, the supposed ransom note that had specific information about John and how much money he had. So somebody had to know that. So the conclusion was somebody had to be so angry that they came in and murdered JonBenet, which is pretty odd. The whole scenario is very, very odd. But I thought it was interesting that they're saying that. So again, they're trying to say it's not a complete stranger. It's somebody who knows John Ramsey and knows the house, and therefore went in and did this horrible thing. There's really no proof that JonBenet was sexually assaulted at the time of the crime, which is interesting, because usually when you see a crime like this, if somebody has actually targeted a child, it's usually a child sex predator. And usually what they want is to rape that child. And they break into the house specifically with the idea of doing that, and yet that didn't happen. So that's also very interesting. So now let's go to the DNA. This is fascinating that now he's saying he would like more DNA testing to be done. So there's two possibilities. Either his family truly has nothing to do with what happened to JonBenet, and therefore he wants everything done that can be done. They're petitioning the governor to say, hey, take it away from Boulder. Let's get another group to analyze everything that hasn't been analyzed, so that we can find some DNA, have that DNA analyzed, and prove who killed JonBenet. Family's totally innocent, and that's why he wants that done. But there is another reason he could be willing to have that done. First of all, let me explain the DNA issue before I go there. All right, let me read this to you from the Daily Camera. It says here about the DNA. Multiple forensic experts who examined the evidence on behalf of the Camera and 9 News disputed all of Lacey's. You remember Lacey? She was the one that said, look, there's DNA here, there's DNA in the panties, there's DNA on the long johns. So that doesn't match the Ramseys, therefore the Ramseys are innocent. And she's the one that has stuck by that. All right. They disputed all of Lacey's conclusions with regard to the DNA. For example, they determined that male DNA located in JonBenét's panties and in 2 spots on her long johns contained genetic material from at least 2 people in addition to the 6-year-old. Okay, that's interesting. Would that mean that 2 people entered the house and 2 people attacked? Okay. As a result, they suggested that the profile, and they put a quote around that profile, entered into the FBI CODIS database in 2003, which it was, and it has gotten absolutely nowhere. It was dubbed as Unknown Male 1 by investigators in the case. May not be the profile of an individual at all, but a conglomeration of genetic material from multiple people. Now that's fascinating because you have to have a certain number of alleles to be able to put it into CODIS. Otherwise, it's just a little piece of DNA and it could match a whole bunch of people. You have to have enough to put it into CODIS. But they're saying this might be a big fat mixture, and therefore it's not even one person. It's really not anything you can prove anything with. So that was very interesting. At the same time, the experts disputed Lacey's conclusions that the genetic material in the long johns, and quotes again, matched the DNA in the panties, that there was no innocent explanation for its presence on the girl's clothing, and that it therefore had to belong to the killer. So Lacey went to say these things all matched, and so, oh my God, there's DNA from a stranger. It's not anybody in the Ramsey family, and it's in her panties, and it's 2 places on her long johns. Oh my God, that's enough proof that this is an outside killer. But there was actually never any proof of that it either matched or it was one extra person's DNA. It was a bunch of conglomeration. All right, so now let me explain what DNA they're looking at, because this is where it gets to be really important and why people don't understand the difference between certain kinds of DNA. Like if you get DNA from semen, DNA from blood, DNA from saliva, and let's say those kind of things appear in the panties, all right? I would venture to say if they had a stranger's DNA from semen or from blood or saliva in her panties, I'm going to say, that's the killer. That's the killer, because how else would that kind of DNA, because you have to get the actual semen into the panties to get that DNA. You have to actually get the blood, like you'd have to, scrape himself or cut himself and touch her, and then his blood would get there, or he had to drool upon her, somehow, I won't go into descriptions of that, but then the saliva would be there too. That's how you could really identify that if that DNA from those 3 things was from a stranger, then the Ramseys had nothing to do with anything. Weird as the whole case is, then you could say, all right, we can ignore everything else and say, how the heck would that get there, except that the killer put it there. All right, now let's move over to the other kind. It's called touch DNA. Now we run into a whole bunch of worms, because people don't understand how easy it is to transfer touch DNA from one surface to another. So, in theory, yes, a killer could be there and he could touch her clothing, and leave his touch DNA there. It's possible. Now, if that specific touch DNA is there and it ends up matching somebody that shouldn't have ever been in their home or shouldn't have ever had contact with anybody in their circle. Let's say that touch DNA ended up being a child predator who they do not know and nobody they know knows. Well, then you'd have to say, how did that touch DNA get there? Because that would be pretty miraculous if it got there some other way than the guy was there. But what if that touch DNA is like John Douglas says, or like John Ramsey seems to think? Oh, it's somebody connected to the family who had this rage against John Ramsey. So it would be somebody they know, or somebody who's been in the house, or whatever. Now here's the problem. Touch DNA transfers very easily. So I could come up to you and give you a hug, and my touch DNA can go on your shirt. You can touch your shirt, and then you can touch somebody else's shirt, and that touch DNA will transfer over. So all of a sudden it looks like I touched that person. There's an interesting case where a person was murdered, and the touch DNA in that case was linked to a homeless man. And, of course, people jumped right to conclusions. Well, some homeless dude was out in the park and, stabbed this guy, killed this guy. Well, it turned out that at the time the guy was being murdered, that homeless guy was in the ICU. Because what happened was the ambulance got to where the homeless guy was, picked him up, took him to the ICU, and then later on went to the murder scene. So one of those ambulance attendants or EMTs transferred the touch DNA from the guy in ICU to the dead guy at the murder scene. So see how quickly that can happen and how easily that can happen? If that poor homeless dude had not been in the ICU, he might have been easily pegged as the killer because, hey, first of all, he's not going to get a good lawyer, right? So he's just going to go down. It's like, hey, your DNA was there. And he's like, and they'd ask him, where were you at that time? And he's like, I don't know. I was wandering around looking in trash cans for food. I mean, the dude would have been, he would have been convicted. So touch DNA is a very squirrely thing. So you have to be very careful with it. So with JonBenet, now I want to talk about the clothing issue. People are a little too, how do I put this? They always think that a parent is always got absolutely clean clothes on their children, and they absolutely change them every single day, and the child never picks out their own clothing. That's not the way things work. Sometimes because you're so busy, the kid will pick out a piece of clothing they wore like a week ago and stick it on themselves. And so she's got these long johns on. Now, I don't know if they were washed right before she put them on, when she put them on, or whether she put them on 3 or 4 times already. And they're long johns, by the way. They're not underwear. There's something that goes over your underwear. So, do I have to admit I have long johns that I don't wash every single time I wear them? That one day I'll pick them up and go, I ought to wash these. They're standing up in the corner. I should wash these. Now, if you wear long johns, and especially with children, first of all, sometimes they wear long johns without any pants over them. They just put like a dress or a big shirt over it, and then they go play with the other children, and their long johns are touching like everybody. So anybody's DNA could be on that, touch DNA could be on those long johns. And that could even come from their parents or a friend of their parents who maybe picked them up and gave them a little hug and touched them, and then they touch JonBenet, and she touches her long johns. And then you have the problem of mom. Let's say mom's taking her up to bed, and she's changing her into. She had supposedly that night had black pants on. Okay, and then she put the long johns on her. It's real hard to know about these things, how accurate this is. But anyway, so when you're removing and putting on clothes, a lot of times those clothes touch each other. So what happens if the touch DNA was on the black pants that she wore to the party? And there's like 6 different men who touched her, or boys. Because some of this DNA, we say male DNA, that doesn't mean it's a 50-year-old man. It could be a 2-year-old boy who's going, hi, JonBenet, and hug on her legs. And then mommy comes home, takes those off, she tosses them, they land on top of the long johns, and then she goes, oh yeah, I'll put the long johns on. She pulls the long johns up, which now have the other touch DNA on it, puts it on JonBenet, and now you've got kitty DNA, little boy DNA, on her long johns. And now they're looking for the killer. Now, do you think they're going to find the DNA of that little boy's? They're not going to go check every little boy that was at party for his DNA. They're not going to do that. So they'll come up with, we don't know who that is. That's how questionable the touch DNA is. It can be useful under certain circumstances, but you have to be very, very careful about jumping to conclusions. So now let me get back to John Ramsey. If his family is entirely innocent, he will want to do everything he can to find out who killed his daughter. I totally agree that that's what he would do. On the other hand, if he's not totally innocent, or someone in his family isn't totally innocent, what does he know? He knows that they can test all they want of JonBenet's clothing and all that. What does it matter that they find? If they find touch DNA from John, touch DNA from Patsy, touch DNA from Burke, so what? They're his family. They're her family. They've been touching her and her clothing. So they would immediately say that doesn't matter. Now, if they had had semen or blood or saliva from John Ramsey or from Burke, because those would be males, or even from Patsy, not the semen part, but the other two, then they might have something. But already they know those three things aren't there. There's no semen, there's no blood that they got any DNA from, and there's no saliva. So consequently, only thing he's worried about is touch DNA. So innocent family, the touch DNA may bring some answers. Not innocent family, the touch DNA will not ever convict his family, because that's just meaningless. So where does that leave us? Well, I don't know. It leaves us probably where we've always been. Unless some very bizarre thing comes of some future DNA, some future touch DNA, I'm going to say this is going to remain an unsolved case, because the touch DNA is really probably not going to prove anything. That's my belief. So anyway, that's my take on the DNA issue. And let me ask you, if you like this video, please do hit the like button. Please do subscribe to the channel and press the bell for notification. And also check my playlist for, I have another video on Jean Bonnet and also many other cases I have analyzed and you might find interesting. So I hope you enjoyed this take and I'll catch you next time. Bye.